I'd like to talk to y'all about the social psychology of personnel selection. If you decided to get the textbook, you won't find this chapter in the book. This is my own creation to torture you because the other lectures don't torture you sufficiently. No, not really. I'm a social psychologist. This is kind of the way I approach the world, is through that lens. So let's talk about it. So why bother with this module, right? Well, because I want to humanize the personnel selection process, and I will continue to do that throughout the course. We're talking about people, we're talking about families, we're talking about communities. And so I always return to that perspective. Understanding of the self is important, extremely important, understanding one's relationship with one's job and one's employers, right? Fundamentally, if we do our job well as managers of human resources, right, personnel professionals, we improve all the selves with which we interact, right, through all stages of the process, the staffing process. So if we ask the right questions of people who are giving us hiring requests, right, and we elicit information from them that facilitates our process, ultimately they're going to feel better about being included in the process, but that the fact our process conforms to their wishes and or elicits maybe problems with what they want, points them out subtly in a way that's non-threatening, so that they feel better as a result of having spoken to us. Also, you guys, how many of you have applied for work multiple times? Do you walk away from that process feeling better about yourself? Let me ask you this. Do you think you could design a hiring process that gives someone the bad news, I'm sorry, you're not what we're looking for, but actually makes them feel better about themselves? I mean, to me, that's the ultimate goal, is to be able to deliver bad news and yet have people feel good upon hearing it. Right? Not always possible, and not for every person, but as a general desired endpoint, how could it be any better, right? So this module is to reintroduce a few key social psychological concepts important, I believe, to the recruitment, selection, and retention process. Many of you have had social psychology, at least a chapter of social psychology in Psych 1100, or have taken an honest-to-God social psychology course. So the social psychological concepts that are important, and I'm going to discuss throughout here, are self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-concept, categorization and stereotypes, motivation, emotional intelligence, and components of the job itself. So let's start with the self, which is a place that many of us like to start, right, with the self. So the roadmap of individual differences. And the reason this is important is well, there's multiple reasons, but let's consider this, that some things are relatively stable in the individual. Other things are somewhat malleable or changeable. Personality traits, man, you know, the general consensus is personality traits are fixed by adolescence for the most part, and relatively immutable, right? Personal values, well, those can change over time, but often those are, you know, relatively unmalleable as well, or not malleable. The self-concept changes over time depending on what domain we're operating in. So self-concept is often thought to be domain-specific. Self-esteem is one of the most changeable of all these items, and self-efficacy is as well. Now, self-monitoring may be less so, but self-monitoring can be taught. Self-monitoring is a tricky concept because there's really two meanings within, one meaning for organizational psychology and one meaning for social psychology. And then the level of organizational identification can fluctuate quite a bit, right? So all these, though, comprise the unique individual. And are we trying to hire people, you know, who are square pegs to fit them in square holes? How much leeway do we have? How much flexibility? Right? So, what do we? All this leads to then attitudes and behavioral intentions. We're going to talk about how to look at those more closely in the future. We're going to be all about abilities, and are we talking about abilities that someone can demonstrate coming in, or are we talking about abilities that we're going to train into somebody? Emotions and what they mean within this context. the level of job satisfaction that one does or does not display, the extent to which someone is able to self-manage or needs continuous supervision. So let's start with the self-concept. This is how one sees themselves. Includes a core system of values and a more variable situational component of the self. So we carry with us, this kind of core set of values, maybe kind of superego-ish type stuff, right? That has been largely the result of our upbringing, our relationship to our religion, to what we've learned in school, but certainly our parents have a strong hand in developing this. Now, situational dependence, or this idea of multiple self-concepts, has been introduced by many people, but I think William James said it, that a man has as many selves as people with whom he interacts. Now, that's probably an extreme view, but teaching Mark ain't the same as pet owner Mark, isn't the same as husband Mark, isn't the same as Uncle Mark. I mean, yeah, the core components, the values are virtually identical across those domains, but the behaviors that you might observe, right, and the outward mannerisms could be markedly different, right? I'm going to be a lot different in my appearance in front of a classroom with you guys than, let's say, I'm going to be necessarily in a faculty meeting. Different aspects of the self become activated depending on the context. So there's room for debate. Social psychologists really emphasize the power of the situation and theorize in terms of the person-situation interaction. So take that core person, but what you observe in that person is that core person interacting with the current environment. Personality psychologists, on the other hand, tend to emphasize personality components that demonstrate consistency across situations. So they might say, well, this person's an extrovert, and they're going to be extrovert in these multiple contexts, right? Ideally, personality and social psychology are used together and then capture the richness of interacting within an environment. We may find it useful to understand and apply both the situational and personality constituents of the self, right? And this is, so when we start thinking about testing candidates, the situation in which they're tested become very important. And we see that a paper and pencil test, where I'm simply answering questions on a paper, is really an impoverished way to look at someone. Putting people into a situational test where they're interacting with others or interacting with machinery or whatever, that is behavioral testing, usually gives us a much richer level of information. Problem with behavioral measures is they're usually more expensive and can be a little more difficult to evaluate. Let's face it, a paper and pencil test, you take it and it puts a number on you, and that's the end of the story. Now, what about self-esteem? Well, this is a valenced evaluation of the self. How am I doing? Good or bad, or somewhere in between, right? People carry around a global trait chronic, those are really synonyms within this area of self-esteem, that overall I view myself relatively positively, or overall I generally have a relatively low opinion of myself. Think about the people who suffer clinical depression, right? Have global trait or chronic low self-esteem. That is kind of an aspect of the disorder. Now, temporary self-esteem, something that was discovered after chronic self-esteem, temporary self-esteem is more state or situation dependent. And we often studied in this laboratory by providing people feedback. We'd give them a test, and it could be a bogus test, randomly assign these people to a condition where they're either told they did well or they did poorly. And then we're able to see the temporary effect of negative feedback or positive feedback on their self-esteem. Right? So you will be able to observe maybe fluctuations in self-esteem based on your testing process for candidates, etc. Self-esteem also differs in stability. That is, does it fluctuate to a great extent, or does it remain pretty consistent regardless of situation? Now, reaction to threat is different based on stability, and people with high self-esteem, right, but it's not very stable, they don't take constructive criticism very well. Those of us who have high self-esteem and it's stable will accept constructive criticism and usually incorporate it into our future endeavors. Now, collective self-esteem, I know, this is our third self-esteem. Collective self-esteem arises from group or organizational membership. Okay, and you can see me express, kind of light up when I talk about, let's say, my connection to the social psychology department. It's a highly ranked department in psychology across the nation, and so I derive a sense of self-esteem just from my membership in that group. That would be collective self-esteem. So, Heatherton and Polivy devised the measure to measure state or temporary self-esteem, and the questions are very similar to the chronic self-esteem scale developed by Rosenberg, but one thing that the questions in the Heatherton and Polivy assessment of state self-esteem is how do you feel right now, right now, right now. That is trying to get people to focus in on their current condition. It was a boon to laboratory research because, like I said, we can manipulate self-esteem, state self-esteem in the laboratory, so we can study the effects of it. Social comparison. In the absence of objective standard of comparison, people will compare themselves to others. And this is something that you have to consider when you're evaluating candidates, when you're testing candidates and eventually evaluating them for their fit to the position, or you're essentially rank ordering candidates, to what extent should you let them know how they have performed in comparison to others? It's natural that they want to know their ranking. It's natural that they want to know how they did compared to someone else. But to what extent do you feel comfortable, or do you think it's useful to convey that information? And I don't have a simple answer for that. Now, let's look at high self-esteem and then low self-esteem combined with fragile versus solid or stable self-esteem. And what we end up with then is a 2x2 matrix, and the people up in this corner here are high stable. And what does that mean? These people think well of themselves, and that opinion doesn't change easily, right? They're able to take constructive criticism. If they fail, it's not the end of the world. They say, look, overall I'm a person of worth, and occasionally I mess up, and it's no big deal because I'll learn from it and correct it. And these people are relatively easy to work with, right? Now, low stable, these are people, this would be a feature, let's say, of clinical depression. Man, I'm no good, I've never been any good, and I never will be any good. Right? It doesn't fluctuate. It's stable, but unfortunately, it's relatively low. Now, here is the wacky spot. High unstable. These people think the world of themselves, but it's not a stable or well-supported opinion. So when you give people with high unstable self-esteem, like corrective feedback, you say, well, that performance wasn't too good. And they say, what do you mean? And they'll immediately get defensive. They'll argue against your measures. These people can be very, very difficult to deal with. And we see with narcissistic personality disorder where this can really be in the extreme. When these people are given negative feedback, they feel threatened, and they will often lash out against that feedback. They can even become violent as a result of it. These are people that, if we could determine, these are people I don't necessarily want to work with, and these are people that if I can avoid hiring them, I might. Now, it's questionable whether this is something we can actually measure in terms of employment and justify doing so. More on that later. Just put that in your back pocket and we can think about it. The bottom one here, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to describe that. You guys can think about that if you will. What does it mean to have low unstable? I don't know. I mean, yeah, never mind. So figure that out. Not every 2x2 matrix I'm discovering fleshes out to 4 boxes. Sometimes like this one, maybe 3 boxes is enough to discuss it. Okay, so then high versus low fragile individual. Okay, consider a high self-esteem that is fragile requires considerable effort to defend. People are always working to defend this level of self-esteem, right? They employ many defense mechanisms. They don't take criticism constructively. They feel it's an attack on them, and it will be perceived as an attack. It's threatening, and they will do their best to label it as unfair, ill-formulated, etc. So any number of tactics to resist or to dismiss this feedback, you'll likely see them employ. These people are a pain in the ass when you get right down to it. They're difficult to deal with, and they're difficult to correct, right? They're difficult to teach or train. These are all kind of negatives associated with that kind of interaction of fragility and high level. Stable self-esteem needs little reassurance and therefore less defense in the face of situational attacks. Right? The folks in this quadrant better able to integrate feedback. Wow, you're right. That could have been a lot better. I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't do this very well. You know what? I'm going to work harder. I'm going to study a little more. And next time, you watch out. This is going to be better. More likely to take risks and demonstrate creativity because they're less afraid of failure. Right? You know what? I had this new idea and I tried it out and shit, it didn't work. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to try it again with these alterations, etc. Creative people will fail. They will fail more than non-creative people. And they stick with it, right? So, less likely to hide evidence of mistakes or failure. That is, the high fragile might hide those mistakes so they can't be brought to anyone's attention. The person with high stable self-esteem, you know, might be the first person to come to their boss and say, boss, I got to talk to you. I really messed this up. I messed this up and what are we going to do? I got some ideas of what to do about it, but I wanted to run it past you and let you know that I messed it up in the first place. Those are the high stables. Now, let's talk about the assessment of self-esteem, especially low self-esteem and the cycle of low self-esteem. So now we're going to go through kind of a little mini systems model. The first box states low self-esteem, and as we move from there, we saw this low self-esteem. People then with low self-esteem generally have negative expectations about their performance, right? And if they have low expectations for their performance, then they might not put in too much effort, and they have high anxiety typically when they're going to perform because they anticipate failure. Now, the failure then, right, to the extent we fail to provide training or place a person in a position beyond their qualifications, we can expect to subject person to more failure experiences. And then the person will blame themselves because they have low self-esteem, right? And then the low self-esteem is reinforced by the self-blame. Again, this is why I think we have such a responsibility when we're hiring, when we're training, when we're thinking in terms of promotion. We don't want to engage in the Peter principle here. If we promote someone beyond their capabilities, they're going to fail, and they're going to fail repeatedly, and we're going to enter them into this cycle of low self-esteem. If we truly care about people, if we're people developers, if we're operating from a position of kindness, then matching the person's qualifications, their knowledge, their skills, their abilities to the requirements of the position is one of the greatest things we can do for them. And keeping someone out of a position who's not qualified, again, while in the short term it might hurt saying, no, you're not qualified for this job, you know, these tests, you know, the tests, we can't rank you into a hiring position for this job. Think about ultimately we're likely doing them a favor. Now, if we hire someone who shows potential, but then we fail to provide the necessary training, we're setting them up for failure as well. So a robust training system that has demonstrated consistent results, successful results in its training, is one of the best gifts that we can give to someone for developing them as a person. Okay. Now, let's talk briefly about contingency of self-worth. The simple idea that performance in some domains is really strongly tied to my self-esteem, while performance in other domains is not. Right? And the example I like to give is, you know, by the time most of us guys hit middle school, same thing for girls, right? we start hitting the growth spurt. And as we emerge into adolescence, a lot of things physically start to shake out with us. You know, what's our height going to be? What is our physique ultimately? Our musculature, our skills, our abilities, especially in an athletic context. Man, you know, when I got to this age, I was watching a lot of my friends, you know, grow significantly, and I wasn't necessarily. I wasn't growing that much. I was growing, you know, kind of slowly to achieve my ultimate, you know, height of 5'8", which is short for an American male, right? 5'10", 5'11", average American height. I'm like 2-3 inches below that. What does that mean? Well, as I entered middle school and then going into high school, I like to play sports, but basketball was slowly, you know, falling off the table, man. If Mark plays basketball, he looks like pretty much like a joke, right? Because all the tall people can reach above me, they can rebound better. Shit, there's people tall enough who can hold the ball up, and I can jump and try and reach the ball, and no matter how high I jump, I can't even touch the ball, you know. If I want to bolster my self-esteem, basketball is not the sport I should be playing. Nor should I get out on the football team, because when I got, you know, first junior year of high school, I said, maybe I'll play football at this new school. Well, I got creamed in practice. I spent 2 days trying to play football. They said, well, at your height and your weight, you should maybe be a halfback or something, you know, or maybe a tight end. And people would just crush me. You know, I was fast enough, but my hands are okay. But it's just not in the cards. What did I do? Well, started playing soccer. And soccer is something I could play, that my build didn't interfere with my ability to play soccer. So I'm going to stay away from basketball because it doesn't provide me healthy feedback for my self-esteem, right? So performance is linked more closely to our that are important to my identity. So what do you think is important for me at this stage in my life? What I do in the classroom, teaching. Right? I'm a teacher. That's my self-concept. That's central to my identity. My performance in teaching, then, has a much more direct tie to my experienced self-esteem than my performance on the basketball court. So, what we see then is poor performance in unimportant areas then has little effect, and you know, if I perform poorly, though, in a domain that's important to my self-esteem, it can have a tremendous impact. Now, what happens when people suffer a poor performance? Well, people do a lot of strange things to protect their self-esteem. This is, in fact, has been a huge research area for 40, 50 years, and what we see is some people engage in self-handicapping. Now, notice, all these can work in different contexts and are used by different people in different contexts. So it's like we can go to the store, the frozen food aisle, and we can select self-esteem enhancement techniques depending on the situation and our skill in using them. Self-handicapping, short one is set up an excuse for failure before it happens. So if you're worried about that exam you're taking tomorrow, you don't think you're going to do well, why not go out and drink tonight? Go out tonight and get shit-faced. Drag your sorry ass into that exam tomorrow. Do poorly, but you know, ultimately what you're going to be able to say is when you get that exam back and you see that crappy grade, you say, you know, well, it's no wonder I did so poorly on this exam. That's the most hungover I've ever been in my life. I know it's a strange excuse, but notice your intelligence is not implicated now. It's the hangover that caused you to do poorly, not your failure as a student. Right? I know, it's crazy. Self-serving cognitions, we just spin it. So self-serving cognitions is spin it in a way. No wonder I did so poorly on that exam. That professor couldn't teach their way out of a paper bag. You know, that we somehow spin the situation to make it less devastating to our self-esteem. Now, on the flip side, we can gain self-esteem by talking about relationships we have, close relationships to important people. Okay? So, we associate with someone successful or famous to boost one's self-esteem. Like I could tell you, I could regale you stories with my babysitter. Right? My babysitter was my mom's friend. A lot of my mom's friends babysat me, you know, and let's talk about Loretta Swit, who played Hot Lips Houlihan on the television show MASH, right? Loretta was my babysitter. I still correspond. Loretta and I still share emails and pictures, whatever, right? Yeah, this gets tiresome to listen to. But notice, what I'm trying to do is boost my self-esteem by talking about an association with someone famous. Or, I could say that Russ Fazio was on my dissertation committee. So those you guys have taken a class of Fazio and you go, oh my God, Professor Fazio. Well, he is on my dissertation committee. Right? So now, let's talk about two more. Downward social comparisons. What do we got? Compare oneself to someone who did more poorly, and then you feel better because they did more poorly, right? And then disidentify with the domain. This is, I am not a basketball player. I will never be a basketball player, and I don't care about being a basketball player. I've disidentified. My identity is not linked to basketball performance. So, to the extent that an employee finds a position damaging to their self-esteem, they're going to seek to disidentify with that position and or the organization. Consider our role in ensuring the success of folks to prevent future disidentification. That is the matchmaking process. Do it well, then we don't have people needing to engage in self-defense mechanisms. We provide opportunities for them to demonstrate how good they are, not confront them with how they measure up. So it really does boil down to kindness, and I'm going to return to this point again and again and again and again throughout our course. Questions? It'd be a good time to take that pause and ask for questions there. Of course, I don't hear your questions. You have to bring your questions to our Zoom session, our weekly Zoom session, and I'm going to be more than happy to answer them at that point in time. Let's talk a little bit about organization identification. We're kind of hinting at it here. It's the incorporation of organizational values into one's identity. It's closely tied to social identity theory. That is, we gain self-esteem from our group memberships, right? So, also leads us to differentiate our in-group from our out-group. And that's the downside to it, is we tend to boost the membership in our group, say, look, we're bitching, and then we start to diminish the evaluation of people in the other group, and that we get a greater increase in self-esteem. And it's a shame because this is often tied to various forms of racism, various forms of ethnic prejudice. Now, self-efficacy. It's the belief in one's ability to be successful in a given endeavor. And this is domain specific, right? I'm not going to be successful on the basketball court, but maybe I can successfully design a course, right? And it's the belief that instructors have had to deal with self-efficacy really big time over the last year. Almost all of us have been exclusively in-person instructors. And suddenly now we're asked to be online instructors, which is a very different process, right? Especially as far as course design, and it's been a struggle for many people. And they don't know that they're going to do well. Their self-efficacy, their belief that they are going to deliver a good, solid, useful course is uncertain, because they've never done it before. Now we come out of this and we see that we're able to develop online courses. It boosts our self-efficacy. It boosts our kind of can-do attitude. So notice that this is derived from our past experience, near experience for many of us instructors. Opinions of your own ability to succeed is really what self-efficacy is can I do this or can I not? Remember the little engine that could? Remember the little engine? And here goes the little engine, and then we see it starts going up this hill, and it's, man, I don't know if I can climb this big-ass hill. But then it's self-efficacy, the confidence kicks in and says, I think I can. And all of a sudden the little engine crests the top of the hill, and it says, I know I can, right? And that is based on the observable performance. Don't we want to hire people and put them in positions where we have a high probability of guaranteeing their success so that we can build their self-efficacy? Isn't that something nice to do for people? Right? So it's the evaluation of our current state. Flip side to that is called learned helplessness. That is the belief that one has little or no control over their environment, and therefore their self-efficacy begins to be eroded. I don't think I can do this. Right? And if we give people impossible deadlines, or we give people responsibilities not equal to the resources we provided them, responsibilities that exceed their resources, or we ask people to do things that they haven't been trained for and they don't know how to do with no help or support, then we push them into a state of learned helplessness, where we see anxiety or we see depression and we see essentially giving up, right, and just absorbing the negative feedback. So what are the effects of high self-efficacy? A couple of them, right? Sources of efficacy beliefs. Let's look at the feedback, the behavioral patterns, and the results. Okay, so sources of self-efficacy belief, like we talked about, prior experience. Behavior models. If I see someone do something successfully and I know that my skills are essentially the same as theirs, then I go, wow, I can do this. Persuasion from others. You can do this. This is what a good leader does, a good manager does. You got this. You know you can do this. You've been through that training. Now it's just time to apply that training, and we got your back. So, right? And assessment of physical and emotional state, and that is feeling good about one's work. Now, self-efficacy beliefs is where we demonstrate then this can-do attitude. I know I can do this job. And what does that lead to? It leads to all these wonderful things that we want to observe in our employees, right? That we're active, we select the best opportunities, we manage the situation, we learn to avoid or neutralize obstacles, right? We set goals and we establish standards. We plan, we prepare, we practice, we try hard, we persevere, or the term that's so in vogue now is grit. We demonstrate grit, right? We creatively solve problems, and we're not afraid to take risks. Right? We learn from setbacks. That is, let's say we're in a creative endeavor and we fail, as we know we will when we're trying to be creative. Then we learn from those setbacks and we continuously get closer to the desired outcome. We're able to visualize success because it's within the realm of possibilities, and it limits the stress that we experience. And some people might argue that it shifts stress to be good stress rather than bad stress, if you will. And what are the results? Freaking success. Are we willing to work hard to ensure systems that allow people to experience a sense of high self-efficacy? Now, let's do the flip side. Let's look at the effects of low self-efficacy. And what do we see? Well, we see that prior experiences, right, lead to self-efficacy beliefs. Low, I don't think I can get this job done. I don't think I'm capable of doing it, right? And so that we see people become more and more passive. They avoid difficult tasks. They ignore them or pawn them off on others. I don't know if I can do this. You want this, right? They develop weak aspirations and low commitment. Maybe I should just find another job. This isn't really for me. I don't think I'm a good fit here. They focus on personal deficiencies. Every time I try this, I seem to do it more and more poorly. They quit, right? They blame setbacks or lack of ability on bad luck. That is, they shift to an external locus of control. They worry, they experience stress, they become depressed. And you know what's happening there? Then their health outcomes become increasingly negative. And that costs companies. And think of excuses for failing. Failure is the ultimate goal. I mean, the ultimate outcome there. Questions? All right. So, we hire people well. We hire them for their knowledge, skills, and ability, or we hire them for the potential and provide them adequate training. Then we'll see that we move into an area of building people up rather than making them suffer. Let's talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. Now, emotional intelligence can be measured quite readily, and if you take Psych of Emotion, it is actually one of the paper topics that's available to folks in that course, right? So what is emotional intelligence? Well, it's a four-part process, and one is self-awareness. That is, am I aware of my emotional states, right? And am I then able to understand what those emotional states mean as to my behavior and my perceptions? So it's one thing to understand, yeah, I'm angry, but what is my naive theory about how anger causes me to behave and how anger causes me to perceive my world? So that's kind of the internalized self-awareness and the creation of theories, naive theories around what those observations mean. Now, self-management is my ability to actually kind of take myself by the horns, if you will, and shift my emotional state, take responsibility for my emotional state, and not make others the victims of my emotional state. So that's self-management. You know, God, I really don't feel like doing this now. Well, okay, so why don't you just go ahead and do it anyway, and then after a little while, guess what? You're going to feel like doing it. And that's been one of the most difficult things for me to learn over the course of my life, but one of the most useful things. Just because I don't feel like doing it doesn't mean that I shouldn't do it. If it needs to be done, I should do it anyway. And interestingly, once I start doing it, then it feels okay. And I've learned that about myself over time and through experience. So it puts me more in charge. I'm more in charge of my emotions than my emotions being in charge of me. Right? Now, the social aspect, the other two components, right, is social awareness. Can I anticipate and detect what someone is feeling, or anticipate what they might be feeling in a certain situation? Do I care? And that is the empathic part, right? And so, do I understand where they're coming from? Do I understand what they're feeling, why they're feeling it, and do I care about it? And then the toughest part of this is the relationship management. That is, I'm willing to in part take responsibility for their feelings. That is, if our partner comes home and we see from their behavior and their posture that they seem extremely distressed, do we then confront them with something that needs to be discussed, right? And then add to their distress, if you will, right? Or do I say, wow, they're really feeling down. Let me see if I can do something to build them up. And then later on, I will save what I needed to say for a later time when they're better able to receive it. That is, am I willing to take responsibility for the other person's emotional state as well? And that's really the gold standard. So the highly emotional, intelligent people have skills in all four of those areas. Who's the go-to? At least in the popular press, Daniel Goleman is the guy to talk about. He wrote the book on emotional intelligence. And empathy really kind of represents the key quality. So you're going to be working in teams, and how many of you have ever gotten angry at someone because they don't seem to be doing things as quickly as you think they should be doing it in a team? Now let's suppose you want to be this person's proponent. Suppose you want to explain why they're not meeting your expectations, right? Oh, they got a full-time job. Oh my God, they just lost a parent. Oh my God, I don't know what's wrong, but it's perhaps something. What can I do to facilitate their performance, right? Or do I just, man, this is pissing me off that they're not getting it done as quickly as I think I should, and because of that I'm going to react negatively towards them. And note then one's emotional reaction is in fact driving them rather than the other way around. So the emotional intelligence, the four skill areas: develop our personal competence, our self-awareness, our naive theories. Self-management, let's learn to control the reactions and the display of reactions. Learn to operate some kind of mask on the face. And then social competence, the other awareness, and this is empathy, that is actually caring rather than just knowing, because I can know and not care, and then it doesn't make any difference. And then the relationship of management is truly taking the responsibility. Now, what does this mean as a hiring professional? That is, would you expect that if you tell someone they didn't get the job because of their performance on the instruments we use to rank order them for hiring, what do you expect? How are they going to react if you tell them, I'm sorry, but, you know, it didn't work out, we're not going to hire you? Can you take responsibility for helping them understand why not in a way that doesn't damage their self-esteem? And do you even care to? Or are you just willing to say, sorry, you lose, get the hell out of here? And it tells us a lot about ourselves, doesn't it? So, had enough self for a minute? Let's talk about categorization and stereotyping then. So, 5 characteristics of categorization. This is according to Gordon Allport. He wrote the book on prejudice in 1954, responding to much of what we were trying to explain as the result of World War II. We encounter stimuli and put it into a category. This is how we function. This is how we understand our world. Hannah just showed up. I look at Hannah. Hannah's a cat. What does that mean? Well, I put Hannah into the cat category, right? So, by doing so, it facilitates associations. What would I expect from Hannah? Well, what are my stereotypes about cats? And my stereotypes about cats have now been activated because I put Hannah into that category, right? Now, one thing about categorization is I want as few categories as I can because it makes my cognition more manageable and more efficient at that point in time. Unfortunately, then, I tend to overgeneralize, right, using very few categories. And I say, oh, those people, they're all like that. No, actually, they're all individuals, right? Categories saturate contents with the same ideational and emotional flavor. So anyone who gets placed into that category then gets my general emotion towards that category applied to them as an individual. And category contents may be more or less rational. That is, stereotypes usually contain a kernel of truth, but that kernel of truth is a tiny kernel of truth and can mislead us very much when we're forming judgments about individuals. So this comes to us from the ABCs of social psychology, right? And what we're looking at is affect, behavior, and cognition. What we just talked about was the cognitive part of stereotyping. That is placing someone into a category and then all the 4 points that follow that. Note, though, that the affective component is prejudice, usually generated in in-group favoritism. So we tend to want to, let's say, for example, hire our own or hire people who are like us. Right? And there's an official term for this in hiring. It's called the just like me bias. I know it's not a fancy term, but we tend to think that the superior candidate is the candidate who's just like me, which of course is an error. And then the behavioral part is a discrimination. So if you've ever wondered about the relationship of those 3 words, stereotyping is the cognitive component, prejudice is affect-driven, and then the behavior towards others, like denying them the job or denying them the position on the basis of their category membership, is the discrimination. Questions? All right. Then, let us talk motivation and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, Maslow said, okay, so I made some mistakes. He said, when I developed his theory, I said needs have to be satisfied in the specific order, and people aren't interested in the higher level needs if the lower level needs have become unmet. And he says, really, there's no empirical research to demonstrate that. But we don't need to throw Maslow out because of that. What I think is so important with Maslow is self-actualization. And Carl Rogers, another humanistic psychologist, posits self-actualization as a basic human need. So to what extent are you willing to participate in a job candidate's self-actualization? That is, to what extent are you willing to help people become the best they can be? And one way to do that is by fitting people accurately to their position. So we assess someone, we assess the position, and if our matchmaking process is successful, we're on the path to helping that person self-actualize. And this is a psychological gift that I think has no parallels. And I keep coming back to this. As human resource professionals, I hope that kindness becomes the ultimate value in how you do your job. And there's nothing more kind than helping people self-actualize. And that's not giving a job to someone who's a poor fit, because if you give a job to someone who's a poor fit, you're just going to point out to them how they're discrepant, how they don't measure up. So you're not doing anybody a favor by putting them into a position out of kindness that they're not qualified for. Now, delivering the bad news, I'm sorry, you're not qualified for this position, you're not a good fit. How we do that is also influenced by kindness. And I see Kyle is going berserk, and he's going to make all kinds of crazy cat-like noises here. So, what are you doing, Kyle? He's not going to make an appearance. He's going to do whatever he's doing there. So, now, Maslow kind of locked himself into saying this is a hierarchical order initially, and we demonstrated empirically that no, not necessarily. Aldifer came in and he said we have three basic needs: existence, relatedness, and growth. And notice these are very similar. All of Maslow's 5 needs fit into Aldifer's 3, so there's a good mapping between these two theorists. But what Aldifer said is, look, this is not hierarchical. One need might be activated at a given time, another need another time. So I think in terms of when you're doing the matchmaking process, when you're looking at candidates and you're looking at the job, you say, well, will this job meet their existence needs? And that's usually the easiest one. Does it pay enough for them to survive, right? Now, that's easy. But to what extent do they have a relatedness need, and to what extent does this position fulfill that? And then I think most importantly, though, is does this person have a strong need for growth, and to what extent will this position facilitate that? So considerations, maybe not central to the position, but a good set of values to have kind of as an overarching guide to doing this work. And needs can be substituted one for another. So, you know, if our relatedness need isn't being met, but our need for growth is being met, then we can substitute those to gain some kind of satisfaction, right? And if we see a need being frustrated, Aldifer said, then what we might see is people regress to a lower level need. So both Aldifer, Maslow describe us as ultimately striving to become the best, most complete, and effective self that we can become. Self-actualization. To the extent we offer effective staffing system, we're more likely to place candidates, employees in a position that allow them to self-actualize. And I think that's the greatest gift that we can give to each other. What qualities do you consider central to yourself, and what qualities of job might allow you to experience self-actualization? And remember, I mentioned briefly before that this course can operate. The main level is how do we place people in positions? But the secondary question, and it's certainly more self-oriented, is how do I understand if this position fits my needs? To what extent is this position a good match for me? Take some responsibility for our own matchmaking process, right? One thing that's dearly important to me in my sense of self is that I kind of call my own shots, right? So by being a teacher at Ohio State in the psychology department, where I teach myriad different courses, but really who's responsible for the course? Who determines its content? Who determines how it will be delivered? Who determines what will be done? And those are my choices, and those are my decisions. So autonomy is really important to me. And I have this amazing gift of a job that allows me to experience and express that autonomy. So I become a very good fit, a very good match for that, right? So for you to understand what's important to you and what jobs are most likely to fulfill those needs. Now, we're going to do an assignment with ONET, and I think that's one way to look at it. I want to mention another website that you might want to go check out. It's called 80,000hours.org. And basically the premise is, you know how long you're going to work? I know. You're going to hate me for saying this. You got at least 80,000 hours of work ahead of you in your life. 40 hours a week. Do the math. 80,000 hours. Son of a bitch. I know. I probably just ruined your day thinking about that. But 80,000 hours org is talking about finding jobs, you know, conceptually that might be good for you. And ONET's going to be the nuts and bolts. So between these tools, we can better assess maybe where we should be going and what we should be doing. All right? So let us then kind of go into this personality-based view, because I've been talking about a lot of situational components, but we've been kind of touching on personality. McClellan, back in the day, right, said there are some basic needs and that we possess these needs as individuals in different configurations. So our need profile is kind of individualized. And what's important then is to understand that certain occupations globally offer certain levels of satisfaction across these three needs, right? So McClellan was a personality psychologist, and what he wants to do is be able to assess job candidates on these needs and then use this information as part of his matchmaking process. How many of you have a high need for achievement? That is a desire to accomplish something difficult. Some people have a high need here. Other people have, it's not that important. What's your need for affiliation? To what extent do you want to spend time in social relationships and activities? To what extent is that important, or to what extent is it not? And then the need for power. What is your need your desire to influence, to coach, to help, to teach, to encourage others to achieve? Now the idea is, if I can somehow assess you on these three needs, and then I can determine occupational profiles and their ability to fulfill these three needs, then it's a very kind of gross method of matchmaking people to positions. Or maybe it's better conceived as disqualifying certain positions as something we just might not be interested in. So, McClellan's need theory then, how do you check this out? And I kind of point this out with a sense of whimsy, and let's not do it this way, right? So, the need for achievement can guide your choices to a great degree, right? What is the need for affiliation is probably not too high, or shouldn't be too high for those in management positions. Because I want you to think about this. How many of you have had a boss who tries to be friends with everybody? It usually is perceived as being amazingly unfair when it's all said and done, right? Note that the need for power can be expressed positively or negatively, and people will express it one way or another necessarily. McClellan goes on to state that managers, and see, this is where we get into this profile idea, goes on to state that managers should probably have a high need for power and a low need for affiliation. As a manager, I influence, I coach, I teach, but it's probably best served by not making tight relationships with people, because sometimes I have to deliver bad news, etc. Research shows that high need for achievement probably not a good management quality. And that one's a little surprising, because what does that mean? Well, if I'm a manager, I need you to achieve, not me. So I achieve through you. So managers with high need for achievement tend to take the best jobs away from their workers where they can achieve, and allow their workers, obviously, or oftentimes with what we call more grunt work. So, personality, it's tough to assess, and I don't know that we should. And, therein lies the rub, as from Hamlet. So, the TAT, and here's how it goes. Let's just take a look at this. You sit down, you're an applicant, and I say, tell me what's going on in this picture. What's the relationship of these two people? What just happened? What do you think is going to happen? And now this is a projective test. You can't know. There's no information there. But if you talk about power themes, then I can assume that you have a high need for power. If you focus your conversation on the relationship, then I'm saying, then probably that person has a high relationship need, And if you talk in terms of achievement, then in fact, so this is a projective test. What's it similar to? The Rorschach ink blot test. This is probably not something we're going to use in personnel selection. But McClellan was a fan of this. So probably not going to be using a whole lot of projective tests. We have much better tests that can be used than these. And these kind of gave psychology kind of a bad name, because they're open to quite a bit of interpretation, and the interpretations were not always reliably consistent. So, what might be the difficulties and pitfalls? Well, of employing projective tests, analyzing the results of projective tests, of using the results to match candidates' promotion. Ultimately, the validity is going to be in question. It's going to be a big chapter for us coming down the road, and the reliability can be shaky at best using these types of tests. So, let us shift gears once again as we kind of look at the light at the end of the tunnel here. You know the old saying, oh my God, light at the end of the tunnel. Let's just hope it's not a train coming our way, right? Let's talk about Vroom's expectancy theory. And in this, I want you to kind of doubly consider the relationship to self-efficacy. Vroom is a model of motivation based on the expectation that a given expenditure effort will yield outcomes and assess the attractiveness of those outcomes. So it's a three-part deal, right? Expectancy is the subjective probability of achieving a given level of performance. So I might say, well, can I teach a course? Can I teach this course? Can I design this course? And yes, but will it then end up being, fulfilling the requirements of the course? And then is what I've done desirable? So when we think about this, when we're dealing with giving people tasks to do, Vroom is saying we really have to, when we're giving someone that task, say, will they believe that if they expend effort, will it get done, right? Will the performance yield that outcome? And then finally, is it something they wanted to do or make happen in the first place? So I ask you then, how might the job itself contribute to this conversation? And jobs do, in fact, contribute largely to this conversation. Let us take a look then at job design. We can look, job enlargement was thought to be to help people escape boredom. It's also known as horizontal loading, and if you can kind of picture an assembly line, that is, instead of just sitting all day putting the hammerhead on the wooden handle, this is your job, right? Well, what happens now is you get the handle, you put the hammerhead, but you also put the deal inside to hold the hammerhead on there, and then maybe the wrapping that goes around the hammer handle to increase the grip. All these tasks are of similar difficulty, but you can see that if I'm running kind of the complete hammer assembly rather than just a piece of the hammer assembly, horizontal loading, and it should go to alleviate boredom and give me a bigger picture of the task. Now that's a very simplified example. Now, job rotation, and this is something that when I worked at the lumber mill we often did, is for 2 hours we do this task, and then the whistle blows, we take our break, and when we come back from break, we move down the line and do the next task. And then we do that until lunchtime, and then we take lunch, and then after lunch we come back and we do yet a third task, and then our second break breaks up the third task from the fourth task. And this is thought to alleviate boredom and to increase people's kind of connection with the job, right? Also, the benefits of job rotation is now I know how to do maybe 4 jobs rather than a single job, so it probably increases my value to the company and increases my sense of self-worth. The one that is the most modern of these 3 approaches and probably has the greatest psychological benefits is job enrichment. This is vertical loading, giving the worker more responsibility to enhance achievement and recognition needs. And when I think about we did some experimentation with job enlargement at the paper mill. And basically what happens is people work at the paper mill and they probably operate this machine and they use these raw materials to operate the machine, right? So let's say I'm operating a packaging line, which I did for a while, and we made cartons of paper, copy paper. And one of the machines that was on my production line was the machine that made the carton. And what it was, you have a flat piece of cardboard that's die cut, and it's fed into the machine, and then 10 reams of paper come in on top of that. And once the 10 reams of paper come in, then there's arms that come up and fold the box around the paper. Glue is put on those by another machine, and then it's held together until it's sealed, and then it moves on. And it's actually going to go to another machine that puts the lid on it in a similar fashion. Well, I operate that, and that's what I do, and I could do that for the rest of my life at the paper mill. But what we thought is, where do these supplies come from? And the interesting thing is that there's a place that makes the cardboard components. We call it the box plant, because what do? They make boxes. Well, what if you give me the additional responsibility? Instead of now having a separate person in the organization meet with vendors, people who sell boxes, what if my role, a secondary role of me as a packaging operator, is to meet with suppliers? So I'm now functioning as a buyer, just not a machine operator. And the buyer then looks at the quantities necessary, the quantities needed, and they're taught to do that. And they're taught to deal with suppliers. They're taught to calculate costs, etc. And now I buy the materials that I use. Notice that buying is probably thought to be a higher level job than operating machine. But now I do both. So we're vertically loading, in terms of responsibility and skills, my relationship to my work. And this has profound effects on people's self-esteem and self-efficacy, because they learn to do new things, they become self-actualized to a greater extent, and they feel greater satisfaction in themselves and their work. So we can think in terms of job enrichment as a technique to increase someone's connection to their job in terms of positive self-outcomes. But think about it from a hiring point of view. That is, now I'm not just hiring someone with the capacity to monitor a machine. I'm hiring someone who needs higher level mathematics skills to do the financial understanding, a certain level of communication skills to interact with the vendors. So it changes the necessary hiring requirements. That is, we're looking for maybe a different person than we were previously. And note, how do you build that into a system? How do you understand that? Note that human resources professionals in an organization that is highly functional, human resources professionals have a very tight relationship with floor managers, supervisors, etc., to really understand what's necessary and really accurately fulfill the needs of their internal customers, who would be supervisors and managers, etc. So, great challenges for us. And the sky is really the limit in determining how we do this. So the principles of vertically loading a job, what are we talking about? Well, remove some control while retaining accountability. That is, we're not going to tell you which cardboard you're going to use in this machine. You're going to have to work to find the vendor and buy the correct materials. But if you don't do it correctly, you know, there's going to be hell to pay, right? So motivators involved, though, for people who want responsibility and who enjoy personal achievement, we have them covered, right? B, we increase the accountability of individuals for their own work. That's a principle. And people then feel more responsible, and we provide them the recognition for a job well done and having done so. Give a person a complete natural unit of work, a module, division, etc. That is, in vertical loading, then, what you become, your packaging line of these multiple machines, right, becomes an entire unit of work. That is, getting the materials, hiring maintenance to repair the machines and adjust them, etc. It puts people in greater touch with what they do and the big picture of what they do, rather than these individual jobs. And I got no idea. I put the hammer head on the handle, and then I just pass it on. I don't know what happens after that. I don't even know how many are packaged in a carton or where they're sold, right? That is, we give people a greater understanding of their place in the larger organization. That's going to increase organizational identity. So responsibility, achievement, and recognition can be the result. Some other principles. Okay. Granting additional authority to an employee performing an activity, and most of us like authority. We like to call our own shots. Again, back to that autonomy idea, right? So responsibility, achievement, and recognition. Making periodic reports directly available to the worker himself rather than the supervisor. That is, if we want people to understand that their process is improving, that the quality of their output is improving, then we need to provide reports for them to be able to understand that. If costs are important, then we provide financial data to the line worker so that they can understand what they can do to reduce costs, right? And this is internal recognition, because you're going, man, you're a person of value and you need to know this, rather than have this information hidden from you. Introduce new and more difficult tasks previously handled. Growth and learning. But notice the challenge for a hiring professional. If this is the plan, if this is what we're going to see happen, then you have to begin to be able to assess potential, that is learning ability, of your employees and make that a factor in the hiring process. And that's pretty difficult. Or not. And a lot of this really is going to exercise, how many of you like to be creative? And I think this is the potential to be creative within the human resources profession is virtually unlimited. That is, how am I going to assess skills? How am I going to do this matchmaking process? What system am I going to create to do this in a way that's valid and reliable? Right? And assigning individuals or specific specialized tasks, enabling them to become experts. And people get the sense of expertise as a result of this. Right? So let's talk a little bit about the job characteristics model, kind of an extension of this idea then. So core job characteristics yield a critical psychological state as we move through this kind of systems model. The critical psychological states really then demonstrate the outcomes. So core job characteristics, does it require a variety of skills? Does the person identify with the task? Is the task believed to be significant? Right? And through this, then, to what extent does this person exhibit a level of autonomy, and to what extent is someone allowed the feedback from the job? Okay? All this then leads to the experience of meaningfulness of work. And to the extent that my work unit expands what I do so that I get a more complete picture of what is done in the organization, right, then my work takes on additional meaning. Now, the experience responsibility of the outcome for the work, right, is enhanced as a result of this. And then knowledge of the actual results of the work activities, that is having measures or having feedback loops that point to what happened. And the outcomes then? High intrinsic work motivation. People want to work for the sake of working, for doing the job. High growth satisfaction, high general job satisfaction all exist under these circumstances. And high work effectiveness as the result of this. People become more effective, more efficient as part of this. So to the extent that we can create this expansion of the jobs, especially through vertical loading as we were describing, we start to change the core job characteristics and we see benefits in the psychological state of those performing the job. Now, we've been talking a lot about the worker through this, but think about hiring managers. And this is where it gets weird, because we say, well, you know, we promote the worker up into the management position. And I don't know that that's always a good choice, and I think it's a good example to describe here. As a manager, who is capable of creating this model, maintaining this model, and measuring the effectiveness of this model? Note that these are some pretty highly skilled managers that can take this shit on. And it maybe isn't the same type of manager we're used to seeing in the past. What skills are necessary, what knowledge is necessary, what ability is necessary for a manager to pull this off. So if we want to operate in this type of organization that values this type of system, notice that it's going to change maybe hiring, how we hire and who we hire as managers. So, what are the moderators of the critical psychological state? Well, you know, the knowledge and skill of the growth need and the context satisfaction. Again, things we can kind of tap into. So, questions, guys? That's about it for now. That's really kind of why I believe this is so important, and why what we do can provide such profound positive psychological outcomes. And if some of you are thinking, well, I'm not sure what I can do with my bachelor's degree in psychology, I guess human resources might be a place for me. I've heard there's a lot of opportunities there. I hope we can all step back together right now and say, you know what? What I believed about human resources was probably a very incomplete picture. I've wanted to help people. I want to pay it forward. I want to make a difference in the world because I want to experience meaningfulness in my work. And I think working in a personnel capacity has the potential to provide us with an amazing level of meaning and an amazing level of self-worth in helping people over a long term, helping people build their careers. And I want to close. When I was at Boise Cascade and I was at the first mill, the Salem mill, there was two people who came to me. Our mill manager, Pete Muleveld, and our human resources manager, Fran Niffen. And they both said the same thing at two different times. They both said, Mark, you might really consider going to college because I think there's a lot there for you. And Boise Cascade will pay 75% of your tuition. And we'll help you manage it. But we really think it would be a good thing for you to do. And I took them up on it. And I did. And had they not shown the interest, had they not pointed away, then it's unlikely I would be here now. And it's a big difference between being a tech rep and helping people, solve their problems in printing plants or copier centers, etc., to be able to hang out with you guys and maybe do this little bit to help you realize your dreams and provide all the amazing benefits that you'll be able to provide to other people. So if you ever kind of step back and say, well, at least I could do human resources, I'm going to ask you to state that a little differently. I am enthused about engaging in the hiring process and the matchmaking process because it can have such a profound effect on people, their families, and their communities. That's about it. So, next lecture, we're going to talk about legality, and we're going to talk about fairness. Tough one, a lot of things to consider in that lecture. It will be an overview. It certainly won't be a complete picture. And we're also going to talk about stressing the importance of legal teams involved in the hiring process and legal advice. So, thank you. Hope you have a good day, and I'll see you on the next one.